TV on satellite television, as well as on our social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Sablor Klama, and I'm here with the English of extrajudicial killings and acts of sexual violence in the Amhara region by Tigrayan forces. The statement said that the government took these allegations very seriously and condemned the deliberate targeting of civilians by its forces, but it said that the international human rights group should be careful not to serve as a voice from propaganda and brazen attempts to whitewash well-documented genocidal campaign against the people of Tigray. Aragawi Gabra Mikhail has more on that.
Tigray External Affairs Office issued a statement on Friday in response to allegations of human rights violation by Tigrayan forces in neighboring Amhara region. The statement said that Tigray's army condones the deliberate targeting of civilians and said the government and its forces had no intention to commit the same horrific atrocities committed on its own people, and said sexual violence was a heinous crime that leaves an enduring physical and psychological scar on its victims. As amply documented by various media outlets and institutions, thousands of Tigrayan women have been victims of this vicious crime. The statement also stated that since August, the Abiy regime and Amhara authorities had called on the rest of Ethiopians to confront Tigrayan forces with whatever weapons at their disposal. On August 10, for instance, as the Associated Press reported, Abiy regime called on all capable citizens to fight in the Tigray war. It is in the context of such toxic discourses coming from the upper echelons of the federal and Amhara regional government that our forces were conducting their defensive operations. The statement also says that in order to incentivize them to obey the immoral instructions of mobilizing civilians for war, the Amhara regional government permitted that civilians would own whatever weapons they managed to wrest from the Tigrayan forces. This irresponsible and dangerous policy effectively put civilians at risk by turning them into combatants without the advantage of trained and armed fighters. According to the statement, the government of Tigray believed that only an independent investigation by an impartial international body can get to the bottom of all the atrocities and feels compelled to address allegations head-on. The statement also says that the Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries and Amhara regional forces have violated particularly every tenet of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in Tigray, and said no village in Tigray has been spared from long reach of these genocidal forces. Their feeble attempt to establish moral equivalence between their forces and that of Tigray's army is designed to conceal the extent of their criminal record in Tigray and for the international community to adopt the position that all sides have committed atrocities, but there can never be equivalence between isolated incidents of misconduct by Tigrayan forces and the systematic campaign to exterminate the people of Tigray. The office reiterated the government's administration for the work of human rights advocates such as Amnesty. However, all the same, Amnesty and other international human rights organizations should not compromise the credibility of their work by unwitting or wittingly becoming accomplices to the Abiy regime's incessant propaganda and brazen attempt to whitewash its well-documented genocidal campaign in Tigray.
The Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals wrote an open letter to the leaders of the European Union and African Union during their joint summit this past week to ask the leaders to address the humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray that has millions in crisis. Aragawi Gabra Mikhail.
The Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals wrote an open letter to EU-AU summit requesting to address the worsening crisis in Tigray. The letter emphasized that the EU-AU summit needs to bring about an end to the brutal siege and de facto humanitarian blockade imposed on Tigray, impose a no-fly zone, arms embargo on Ethiopia and Eritrea, make sure the immediate and verifiable withdrawal of Eritrean forces, hold accountability to the war crimes against humanity and genocide, table an immediate negotiation to end hostilities, begin the process of national dialogue and the immediate release of arrested and unlawfully detained Tigrayans and other Ethiopians. The letter by the Global Society of Tigrayan Scholars and Professionals also stated that the war on Tigray has involved scores of documented mass massacres, widespread of rape, and conflict-related sexual violence on a massive scale, which led to an ethnic cleansing of more than 1 million Tigrayans from western Tigray only as part of hostile and illegal occupation of Tigrayan lands by Amhara forces. According to the Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals letter, the Ethiopian government has systematically and deliberately weaponized starvation by destroying livelihoods, public infrastructures, and other objectives indispensable to the survival of Tigrayan civilian populations, including the devastation of the agricultural system in the initial phase of the war, through the deliberate burning of foodstuff, livestock, crops, and the destruction of vital agricultural supplies, including seeds, farm tools, and irrigation works, in violation of Article 54 of the Protocols of the Geneva Convention of 1949 and 1977 of the Protection of Victims of International Armed Conflicts.
Even after a devastating year of a conflict, Tigrayans celebrated Lekatit Asert Hada as a demonstration of their commitment towards the value of justice and their commitment to resist tyrannical rule. Our reporter Fanuel Mirur looks back at the historical implications of that day and its resonance with the people of Tigray.
For more than 4 decades, Ethiopia had been under the rule of an imperialist administration led by Emperor Haile Selassie, a feudal system that depended on the exploitation of peasant labor. But by the 1970s, protests across the discriminatory and suppressive behavior of the administration would lead to widespread demonstrations across the state. Students, farmers, drivers, and bankers would lead a revolution to overthrow the imperial system. Then the only organized force, the military junta known as Derg, ousted the imperialist administration through coup d'etat and took power in September 1974. The Derg had taken some promising measures at the start of his rather brutal rule, with a reform on policies regarding land ownership and the establishment of a secular government, but all overshadowed by its ruthless reaction to any form of opposition, illustrated when it killed 60 political figures from the previous regime. The fascist mantra, Ethiopia Tikdem, or Ethiopia First, would be used to arbitrarily arrest, kill, and forcibly recruit youth across Ethiopia. In an effort to wipe out all forms of opposition, the Derg would launch Shibir, or Red Terror, killing over 500,000 people in a span of 2 years. Owing to the oppressive nature of the Derg, youth across the country would mobilize for an organized resistance against the state. According to Mulgeta Chalto, a former member of the TPLF who has written extensively on the party's history, the proximity of Tigray to the liberation within Eritrea, its rugged topography, and the region's history of resistance against foreign aggression and the oppression of the empire's regime made it a preferred location for the launching of various rebellions. One of the rebellions would be launched on February 18, 1975. 11 Tigrayans would gather in the village of Dedebit to launch Tigray People's Liberation Front. The front would come to lead the armed resistance of the Tigrayan people against the Derg. This revolution succeeded the former Wayana movement initiated in 1945 to fight against the imperialist regime of Haile Selassie. The Dagmay Wayana movement's aim was to put an end to the dictatorial administration of the Derg regime and free the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia by democratizing the empire.
ኣብ ከተማ ጥራሕ ኮይንካ ዝግበር ፖለቲካዊ ቃልሲ ጥራሕ እውን ነቲ ናይ ከተማ ህዝቢ ጥራሕ ሒዝካ ኣብ ዝብፅሕ የብሉን ብዝብል ናብ ናይ ዕጥቃዊ ቃልሲ ዝመርሕ ውድብ ንምስራት ክንሰጋገር ኣለና ዝብል ዝለዓለ ፖለቲካዊ ውሳነ ወሲኑ
Ever since, the people of Tigray have celebrated February 18 or Lekatit 11 as start of Tigray's armed resistance against the military junta, but also started to an organized resistance against perverted and tyrannical leadership that failed to address the basic needs of its people.
لكايت عسد حدا ترى معلتي كنت سلازي وان طميت قنطيرو زحابه الاخلي سوا صميقو عبدن بسدت بحدا معلت هندبت هويل تلعيلو وزاتنيات تداناغيصم اخلو وحدنا كفينا مريرنا لدخن تلعيلهم تداناغيصم
Within 15 years of the start of the armed resistance, TPLF would manage to free the entirety of Tigray from the Derg. Later on, TPLF would later form an alliance with other Ethiopian entities to free Ethiopia from military rule. In May 1991, the joint forces of EPRDF marched into the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and initiated a transitional government to govern the country for the coming 2 years. The transitional government would give time for the formation of a new constitutional arrangement giving birth to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. The constitution had reformed the Ethiopian state by giving recognition to the diversity of the Ethiopian state, but it would pave a way for the very first election in the history of the country in 1995. Along with the process of democratization, the EPRDF government would initiate a development agenda that would rapidly expand infrastructure across the state and basic services such as healthcare and education. Ethiopia would enjoy double-digit growth for well over a decade as millions were dragged out of poverty.
February 18th, commonly referred to as Lekatit Asert Hada in Tigray, marks a day of resistance and bravery. 47 years ago this week, Tigrayans from different walks of life would come together to start an armed resistance against the brutal Derg regime. Every year since then, Tigrayans everywhere celebrate Lekatit Asert Hada in the honor of thousands that have paid a sacrifice in the name of justice and equality. Abraha Gabretensay has more on that.
The 47th anniversary of the start of the armed resistance against the tyrannical rule of the Derg and the founding of the party that led it, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, was colorfully celebrated across Tigray this year. Thousands across the state marched to mark the historical day. Many carried the Tigrayan flag, waving it with pride, promising not to be broken by the violence of the allied Ethiopian and Eritrean forces and to maintain their resistance. Getachew Reda, member of Tigray Central Command, addressed Mekelle City residents gathered at Mekelle Martyrs Monument to mark the date of the start of the armed resistance and reminded all that the month of February marked a time of resistance for youth across different parts of Ethiopia.
يكاتيت ناي أنصار وزعة أنصار كل عينت ناي قبل على هزبتات سكبر وزعة أنصار مجزأتي أنصار بارنت استولع قالسين كل وتاتات منسي بعسرت أشحات تسلفوا ثلاثة أربعة ورحب زي ما اللي جزء صلاتنا كم متكع ناقدمان ألتميت لكم ذرعهم بعسرت أشحات سرايت سلاين ناي شعبي أولو ناي بلسقنا أولو ناي تسفافحت حيلتات محرا أولو بقى ما يتشحات قصر سرايت دوك بلو زي خاله لإلو قصرو عقمك فتر زخاله هزو تግራይ استفله هزو سلازغونه إلا هنا أمطي خلص هزو تግራይ استفله زغونه لبزح كواليتات بزح كبرتات له.
Even after a devastating year of conflict and unspeakable atrocities across the state, this year's celebration of Lekat 11 is a clear indicator that Tigrayans remain devoted to the values of justice and resistance against tyrannical rule.
Water facilities and equipment have been the target of a systematic and deliberate destruction of over 54% of water facilities in rural areas and 40% in urban areas either damaged or looted, leaving locals with no option but to drink unfiltered water. Mironiman has more on that.
This is a water tank in the district of Tanqamalash, in the town of Mayaini, which was destroyed by the Allied forces. While some parts of it was subjected to a deliberate destruction with explosive weapons, some of it was looted. As a result, the people are forced to drink the same murky water as animals.
There were water taps that are now destroyed and are no longer functioning.
Tedros Ghebreyesus, the head of the Water Facility Institutions, explains the destruction that has been done on the water facilities in Tigray, with the exception of western and northwestern Tigray and some of the eastern zone.
Out of the 17,206 water facility institutions we assessed, 9,302 of them have been destroyed, which accounts to about 54% of the total number we managed to assess. This is in the rural areas. In the urban areas, over 40 water facility institutions have also been destroyed.
Additionally, the head explained that over 3.5 million people are prone to waterborne diseases.
In the urban and rural areas, over 3.5 million people are suffering due to lack of clean water and are prone to different waterborne diseases with the possibility of having to face death.
The head also mentioned that even though an agreement with humanitarian organizations has been reached to mend and repair the water system, it wasn't possible to do so as the equipment's parts weren't available due to the all-encompassing siege around Tigray.
ነዚ ተፈጢሩ ዘሎ ጸገም ንምቅላል ብዙሕ ጻዕርታት ሞክሮም እዮም
Several humanitarian organizations in our area have attempted to help. However, due to the siege imposed on Tigray, it has become impossible to turn things back to their normal situation in the same way the Ethiopian government has blocked food and medical supplies. Right now, almost all water facility institutions are destroyed.
Children's and internally displaced persons camps across the state have been one of the most affected due to the ongoing conflict, with the blockade on essentials such as food and medical supplies exacerbating an already dire humanitarian situation. Kibromul Debrhan has more on that.
Trahas is a young girl who has been forced to abandon her former residence due to the war that broke out in Tigray. She has witnessed so many horrific scenes on her 5 days long journey to the IDP center in Aksum, where she is now sheltered.
I've seen many corpses lying down on the ground on my way here. It was an excruciating experience. I hope God helps us return back home as soon as possible. Right now, what we really want is to get back home and be able to pursue our education. Things are okay here, except that there isn't enough food.
After the 8 months occupation of Tigray by the allied Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, where it was almost impossible to move around freely, Trahas says that she has now been able to regain her freedom.
During your last visit in the summer, I used to be terrified because we were under invasion at the time.
Contrarily, she says that she is in an exceedingly difficult situation due to the siege that has been imposed on Tigray. She added that she is greatly concerned about the drone attacks that was executed on the IDP center in Dedabit.
You can have access to everything you want when you're at home. However, here, we can't easily get what we want, food included. It is tragic how they went from Humera to be sheltered in Dedabit IDP center. And what happened to them was that they died because of the drone attack.
Finally, Trahas expressed her gratitude to all the residents of Aksum for being there for them when they needed them the most. However, now she is working hard in order to fend for herself, no matter how difficult the situation seems to be.
Instead of being ideal and beg people for money, I have decided that it is better that I sell some of the items here on the street. This will help me a bit. Many women in Magala, capital of Tigray, are unable to work and earn their daily bread due to the siege. They've been suffering from man-made starvation ever since the siege began 7 months ago. Amanuel Amara reports.
Kiros Abadi, resident of northern sub-city in Magala, used to work as a daily laborer right before the city fell under the occupation of the Ethiopian army. However, now she is unable to work and earn her daily bread due to the siege. She has fallen victim to a severe starvation as the siege tightens and food items run out from stores.
I get heart attacks frequently. I'm only surviving with the food my neighbors provide me with.
She also said that the other reason that has sickened her is because the owners of the house she used to live in told her to leave.
I was told to pay the monthly fee for house rent, but I couldn't. How could I? There is no job or anything. I told some people to help me find a house, and thank God they gave me this house.
Kiros is one of the many other women who are living in a very difficult situation. As the all-encompassing siege continues, they have totally become unable to feed themselves.
We used to participate in some daily activities and managed to feed our children. But at this time, everything is closed down because of the siege.
I am in a dire situation. My children are starving. Somebody brought me this injera, which is only enough to feed us through the day. The owner of my previous house kicked me out because I couldn't pay the monthly fee for house rent. Fortunately, some guy gave me this house where I live in now. I'm really grateful to him.
The women further suggested that we should all help each other so that we can be able to live through the challenge we are faced with at the moment and live to fight another day.
There are many in trouble in the same way as I am. I wish we can all get help. I would like to plead for everyone who can help me. I'm in a dire situation along with my 2 children.
We are living in a rent house and we are in a dire situation. Our neighbors do share with us what little they have. I say that we should help each other so that we can live through these dark days.
Environment protection and forest restoration has been one of the central policies of the TPLF since its early days of its founding. These early efforts have received worldwide acclaim, winning the Equator Prize in Brazil in 2012 and Future Policy Gold Award in China in 2017 for conservation-based agricultural development-led industrialization policy. Here are the details. Tigray, located in the highlands of eastern Africa, was affected by centuries-long severe land degradation comprised of soil erosion, deforestation, declining biodiversity, and lack of soil moisture, attributed to the heavy population concentration in the highlands. People strived to increase food production with subsistence farming and by expanding farming on marginal land. Soil fertility was depleted, resulting in a decline in agricultural productivity. The drylands covered 40% of Tigray's earth before 1991. Drought would become recurrent and food security the norm. In 1985, famine had devastated millions of Tigrayans, leading to the death of over 1 million people.
There's no point in fighting if the people are finished. This is the saddest time in my life.
Tigray was one of the degraded sites in northern Ethiopia. Agriculture has been in this part of the country for more than 3,000 years. People were farming for long years, and the increase in farmland is at the expense of this forest.
Addressing the challenges of land degradation was therefore not an issue that could be delayed any further. That's why in 1988, the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Relief Society of Tigray, with the assistance of donors, launched its soil water conservation programs to mobilize communities across liberated areas in Tigray to address environmental challenges. After the downfall of the Derg and the establishment of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia in 1991, the country was led to a wide process of decentralization in which political, fiscal, and administrative powers were reallocated to each of the country's 9 regions and urban administrations. But TPLF's rural-based and environmentally friendly policies would expand nationally. The APRDF-led government of Ethiopia developed the agricultural development-led industrialization policy. The focus of ADLI was not the same in all states. In 1994, Tigray adopted the conservation-based agricultural development-led industrialization strategy to respond to the region's food security and agricultural productivity challenge, based on rehabilitation, conservation, development of natural resources, and people's participation.
I'm immensely proud to be able to speak today, not on behalf of my country, Ethiopia, but on behalf of Mother Africa as a whole.
Nice to see you. Good to see you. You have been working so hard. I'm very impressed.
TPLF-led efforts to reverse land degradation and rehabilitate the environment would be considered revolutionary. Chris Rage, a researcher with the World Resources Institute in Washington, would tell The Guardian the scale of restoration of degraded land in Tigray is possibly unmatched anywhere else in the world. The people may have moved more earth and stone in recent years to reshape the surface of their land than the Egyptians during thousands of years to build the pyramids. The concerted efforts towards land and soil conservation would receive worldwide acclaim. Abraha Atzbaha district in Tigray would receive the Equator Prize in 2012 for restoration of the environment. A Bahawi, an exemplary farmer that received the Equator Award, is a village chief of Abraha Atzbaha vicinity in Tigray. In an interview he had with Center for International Forestry Research, C4, he described how difficult it was to transform the dry land into a green area.
I didn't imagine this would be possible. It was very dry and degraded. I feel proud. Now that I'm successful in this village, I want to replicate these practices across the country.
In September 2017, the World Future Policy Gold Award was given to the people of Tigray for efforts to restore land on a massive scale. Yet in the 1960s, Tigray's soil water conservation programs were essentially absent and land degradation was rampant. The situation would change for areas about 1,800 meters sea level in the Hausi Doga and Doga agroecological belts.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, This year's Gold Award goes to Africa, the continent most severely impacted by land degradation. Ethiopia's Tigray region has made remarkable progress in restoring degraded land and improving food and water security. For its mass mobilization of people and its outstanding achievements under harsh conditions, Tigray's policy is celebrated with the Future Policy Gold Award 2017.
The implementation of ADLI in Tigray is efficiently enhanced by mass mobilization campaigns that promote the use of voluntary labor to create productive assets, and the youth-responsive land policy that gives legal landholding certificates and extension support to landless youth. The government of Tigray mobilized villagers to volunteer 20 days a year to build terraces, irrigation projects, build stone walls on mountains and hillsides, and other projects. The Soil and Water Conservation Program emphasized the importance of community involvement at all levels, including problem identification, planning, implementation, and evaluation. As a result, groundwater level have risen, soil erosion have been reduced, and people's ability to grow food and gain an income has improved.
During the climate summit in New York in 2014, the country committed itself to managing 15 million hectares of degraded land to be rehabilitated by 2025.
For its remarkable achievements in participatory land restoration, Tigray's policy won the Future Policy Award in 2017, which is the only award which honors policies rather than people on an international level. While China and Brazil won Silver Award, countries such as Australia, Jordan, and Niger won Bronze Award for their policies and efforts to protect the environment. The Future Policy scorecard included the fact that foster sustainable livelihoods, women were 40% of the public that participated in its introduction to the youth-responsive land policy, which helped reduce unemployment amongst young people. Widespread mobilization of the local population also ensured the implementation of the policy. The policy also set up agricultural extension services and farmers' training centers. Demonstration centers were established in order to train farmers in soil and water conservation techniques. Food aid was used as a source of motivation for soil and water conservation activities. The area of land that were terraced between 1988 and 1995 in Tigray amounted to approximately 418,500 hectares. This massive investment to address environmental degradation in Tigray would pay off with the restoration of degraded mountains, landscapes, and improvements of living conditions of farmers across the region. The once poverty-stricken region became a symbol of change, restoration, and improvement for life conditions of its population, as its impacts of drought on livelihood of farmers were significantly reduced. TPLF's chairman and Ethiopia's Prime Minister Meles Zenawi would later represent the African voice at Copenhagen in 2009, when the world would come together to discuss the issues of climate and global warming and the issues of funding for green energy.
The risk of catastrophic climate change is very real. The science is as clear as it could ever be as to what the cause of such change are. It is no exaggeration to say that this is our best and perhaps our last chance to save our planet from destructive and unpredictable change. If we fail to rise above the current challenge of climate change, we will then have proved that global economic progress is based on a fundamentally dysfunctional global political system. What is at stake here is the future of our species, the future of human civilization as we have come to know it. Africa is keenly aware of the significance of climate change negotiations and the Copenhagen summit. That is why, for the first time since the establishment of the Organization of the African Union, Africa has decided to speak with one voice and to field a single negotiating team mandated to negotiate on behalf of all the member states of the African Union.
But since Abiy Ahmed's ascendance to power, Ethiopia's policies towards environmental conservation has become rather unclear and appears to be focused on attracting public attention rather than putting in effort to contribute towards a cleaner and safe environment. Once a leading force in policy and conservation and climate change, Ethiopia's name has now instead become synonymous with violence and destruction amounting to genocide. Literacy rates in Ethiopia had been one of the lowest in any African country, with rapid expansion of infrastructure in the past few decades leading to a remarkable improvement in access to education across the country. Our reporter Abel Tsagabu looks at TPLF legacy in terms of expansion of education from the time of the armed struggle.
In a country where literacy rates in 1960s were below 10%, the small number of students who gained entry into Ethiopia's only university constitutes a privileged minority. It has been estimated that no more than 8,000 Ethiopians held higher degrees, including university graduates in 1970s, and that Ethiopia had one of the smallest educated classes as a percentage of its population of any country in Africa. Moreover, university students at former Haile Selassie University came from urban families of traders, clerks, policemen, lower-level government employees, in other words, the Ethiopian then petty bourgeoisie. Apart from those few privileged members of society, the rest of Ethiopia had no access to education. Oromos, who constituted the largest number in Ethiopia, comprised less than 10% of the university students' population at the end of 1960s. Muslim, who almost constituted half of the population in Ethiopia, were just a minority in state education in Ethiopia. Females were also a negligible force, comprising of just 9% of the students' body. Pre-1974, Tigray possessed no industry, no commercial farms, no mines, and post-secondary education institutions, and trade was largely limited to export of grains and cattle and the import of basic manufactured items. Urban areas were almost non-existent, and its largest town and capital, Mekelle, had less than 70,000 residents. The other major towns in the region were even much smaller. Above all, the bitterness of the Tigrayan petty bourgeoisie revolved around the denial of education opportunities. The educational system in Tigray was dismal. There was no university or college until the mid-1990s, and there were only 4 high schools, but these offered inadequate teachers and facilities for a population of about 3 million people and had only been built in the late 1960s. High school students had been engaged in irregular movements to protest the dismal condition of their schools and the misery in the region in general, but had no associational structures through which they could pursue their demands. But a few educated Tigrayans began to raise their voice against the social injustice against Tigrayans. The TPLF. Tigray University Students Association was formed in 1972 and worked to raise political consciousness amongst Tigrayans and form a connection to the Tigray National Organization, TNO, the precursor of the TPLF. The TNO was established shortly after the Derg took power and only operated for 6 months, serving as a link between the revolutionary in the university and their supporters in the small towns of Tigray, until the TPLF took form in February 1975. Their supporters largely comprised of high school students or university students who volunteered on their summer holiday or when university closed due to strikes. TNO activities focused on their native Aurajas, former Tigray zonal arrangements, and built up a basis of support they could turn when they would eventually start the armed resistance in the field. The TNO, later TPLF, had articulated genuine grievances in the Tigrayan community. These grievances included the demand for Tigrayan equality, ending discrimination in government, employment and education, more schools, hospitals and other infrastructures, and an end to the Amharization of the Ethiopian Empire. The TPLF gave massive attention to education since the very first days of its establishments. The TPLF fighters were given discipline and political lessons almost every day. There were political cadres in every unit, small or big, who ensured adherence to the code of conduct and who took care of the daily lessons of the fighters. A command and staff training center, which was called Hakhvan Military School, was created following the directions imposed on the first Congress of the TPLF in January 1979. Many agree that this school has provided military science to the long-lasting history of Tigrayan heroism. Furthermore, a new structure of schooling of civilians was created under the name of Shigoyenti, which means Torch of the Revolution, a political training school that aims on creating awareness of the revolution to peasants in Tigray under the guidance of TPLF Political Bureau. Even though the history of TPLF and education starts earlier, the attention given after July 1976, when the Department of Logistics, Education and Agriculture were created in addition to the former departments of the party, including Health, the Public Relation, the Cultural departments, was unprecedented. The leaders of TPLF had known the importance of education from the get-go, because not only did they advance the cultural level of the people, but they also serve to deepen political and national consciousness and train a future generation of youth who could be utilized in the protracted struggle of 17 years.
Good morning, class. Good morning, class.
Most importantly, the educational system established during the resistance would establish Tigrinya as a language of instruction, giving the people a sense of pride to learn and write in their own language. The study of history in turn was used as a means to examine the oppression of the Tigrayan people, the record of resistance, and the role of the TPLF in the struggle for self-determination. Indeed, all the subjects taught in the TPLF established schools were used to advance the consciousness of the people and strengthen their loyalty to the revolutionary front. Initially, the party had limited access to material and human resource. After 1980, it had a growing supply of skilled personnel, filling the Derg's terror in the towns who could be employed to strengthen the education system. The party responded by preparing a curriculum to teach peasants along with its fighters. The educational policy was developed with the peasants and approved at the Baitos, Tigray Peasants Administrative Council. The TPLF developed Baitos to address basic needs in Tigray. Baitos were structures composed of elected local governments at the district level. These Baitos were institutions for public participation and accountability for the TPLF. The TPLF gave political and academic training in its training centers to men and women in the liberated areas with some educational background. These trainees were then assigned to school as teachers. By 1985, there were about 674 TPLF-trained teachers in 58 primary schools with 90,800 pupils. Later on, after the change of leadership in TPLF, in July 1975, the TPLF opened Mayday School, aiming to teach political ideology of the party to commanders with peasant background and to make them competent with those who have taken long lessons in the political education schools. Many scholars and political analysts agree that the organizational character of the TPLF and the attention it gave to schooling and peasants' improvement made the front win over other parties and fronts established in the late 1960s in Tigray and the rest of Ethiopia to resist the Derg. The TPLF and its allies within the APRDF marched to Addis Ababa on May 28, 1991. 3 days later, the APRDF established provisional administration. One of the main goals of the provisional government was to give the national exam for junior high school leaving certificate exams, and to perform higher education year-end closings in addition to pay salaries for teachers and other civil servants. The net enrollment rate in elementary education, for instance, jumped from only 29% in 1989 to 86% in 2015. Ethiopian government statistics report that the number of elementary schools tripled from 11,000 in 1996 to 32,048 in 2014, while the number of students enrolled in these schools increased from less than 3 million to more than 18 million. There were just 3 universities in 1991 when the APRDF came to power. By 2017, there were 30 public universities as well as a growing private sectors. Ethiopia didn't have a single privately owned tertiary institution before the early 1990s, but there are now 61 accredited private higher education institutes. The overall number of tertiary students in both public and private institutions exploded by more than 2,000%, from 34,000 in 1991 to 757,000 in 2014. TPLF and EPRDF contribution towards the education sector in Ethiopia was remarkable. A country that has one of the poor education systems in the world due to armed conflict, famine, and humanitarian crisis was transformed. Enrollment of children at school age reached above 95% coverage. The expansion of secondary and tertiary level education was massive. A country with intake capacity of few thousands in 1991 expanded to over 400,000 in the year of 2014. The Tigray People Liberation Front has played a key role in fighting illiteracy, giving fundamental science and mathematics, and creating political and historical consciousness of the people of Tigray. For whatever else may be said about TPLF legacy in Ethiopia, its commitment towards human development in Ethiopia is not only unprecedented in previous political organizations, but has brought about radical change in democratizing access to education.
Lakatit Asartada, or February 18th, marks 47th anniversary of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. The resistance led by the front would take almost 17 years to defeat the military rule of Mengistu Haile-Mariam, but our reporter Salome Taghlai finds that the front's fight for the expansion of healthcare and better living had started much earlier. Salome Taghlai has more for us.
Tigray People's Liberation Front was formed on February 18, 1975 to lead an armed resistance against the Derg, a military government that would inflict unimaginable damage on Ethiopians everywhere. Over a course of 17 years, TPLF would mobilize Tigrayans everywhere to feed into a people's revolution that would overthrow the Derg. But its resistance against poverty and towards human development would start much earlier. Just a few years into its establishment, TPLF would start to develop policies around education, land ownership, and healthcare in liberated areas across Tigray. The TPLF developed the Baito health system to address basic needs in Tigray. Baitos were structures composed of elected local governments at the district level. These Baitos were institutions for public participation and accountability for the TPLF. The Baitos would build health stations consisting of an average of 10 rooms, including delivery and emergency rooms for the community. The Baitos would also mobilize to raise funds for drugs and medical equipment. Since the shortage of healthcare workers and the health stations had become a hindrance, the TPLF would found Rahwa Nursing School. The local Baitos, together with public relation officers of the TPLF, would then recruit people from the population for trainings. In addition to the training programs, the Department of Health had two publications, T'anna or Health, which was aimed at healthcare workers, and Mikilkhal or Prevention for the public. Prevention covered topics such as control of malaria, AIDS prevention, personal and public hygiene, and first aid treatment. In a meeting in 1987, after hearing arguments about whether to focus on curing diseases or on preventing them, it was decided that the health system would be primarily focused on prevention. It was also during this meeting that the health system was decided to be democratic and revolutionary, where people could participate directly through the local Baitos and new ideas could be raised from the people rather than coming down from higher ups. Dr. Gabrab Barnabas, former head of the Tigray Bureau of Health and a member of the then TPLF Health Department, says that the Baito health system was the first in the history of the country to implement primary health care and in fact was working to achieve the Al-Ma'ata Health for All Declaration of 1978.
There was a worldwide movement initiated by WHO and UNICEF in Almaty, which is currently in Kazakhstan, in 1978. They launched Health for All by the year 2000. And at that time, Tigray was at war with its own central government. It was a military dictatorship, but we were trying to develop a new healthcare system based on the Health for All by the year 2000 in wartime. The primary health care in wartime did tally with the policies of the military regime. They also adopted primary health care, but they never implemented it. They failed. The difference was here. We implemented primary health care in wartime and later in peacetime. The previous regimes, including the imperial regime and the military regime, failed to implement it. The military regime that took over had no idea about what is a progressive, public-oriented health system. They continued the doctor-based, hospital-based, disease-oriented health system, even though on policy level they said we support health for all by the year 2000. So for the first time in Ethiopia, primary health care was implemented in wartime.
After deciding that the health system was primarily to be preventive, specific strategies to implement those policies were formulated. The Baitos were to play the leading role in delivery of healthcare. The preventive approach was to be the priority alongside improving the quality of curative services. Health service delivery was to give greater priority to the lower echelons of the healthcare system than the hospital level. Training for health workers was prioritized. The curricula selected were required to be relevant and practical. An essential drug list was established, as were rules regarding the storage, distribution, and utilization of drugs. Free treatment was made available for war injuries, medical and surgical emergencies, deliveries, and epidemic diseases. For other conditions, those able to pay were expected to do so. Private sector pharmacies, clinics, and hospitals were allowed, but had to be certified by the Department of Health and licensed by the BITO Trade and Commerce Committee. International support was recognized as important, but had to be subservient to local policies and initiatives, and all NGOs had to sign a multi-party agreement with local BITOs, Relief Society of Tigray, and the Department of Health. The Department of Health were restructured to facilitate collective leadership, as well as the periodic draft of a plan of action and regular evaluation. Health Department of the TPLF was also engaged in controlling epidemic diseases like malaria by providing chloroquine tablets to pregnant women, children under the age of 5, and patients with chronic illnesses. There were also a campaign every September to clean houses and dry swamps since there were no insecticides. The concepts of the BITO health system continued to be practiced after the overthrow of the Derg as well. In 2003, the Health Extension Service was launched with more than 30,000 women trained and placed in health posts in their vicinities.
About 5 years ago, the Ethiopian government launched a program which is called the Health Extension Program, which is another name for primary health care. A program which started by training 30,000 female health extension workers nationally. For Tigray, this came about 1,800 female health extension workers. And then the Global Fund, UNICEF, and other partners like the FID, also USAID, all contributed towards building structures like health centers. There are now 3,200 health centers being built with the help of the Global Fund, 50% contributed by the Ethiopian government and 50% by the donors.
The concept of health extension program was developed by former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi and aimed at providing health care to pregnant women and infants.
Ethiopia's added 35,000 new health workers, and they're all over the country available to help out with basic health needs. And it's making a big difference in helping mothers do the right things with newborns, helping with infectious disease and sanitation. It's a system that they keep trying to improve because they're very serious about having Ethiopia be a healthier place. The key thing in a health system for a poor country is access, having nearby what are called primary health centers, and having people who have the right drugs and the right training to help you out with the things that need to be nearby. The lowest level, the primary health care center, is called the health post in Ethiopia. And these are very new. They've been staffed by 2 young women each, so they've put out 15,000 of these posts, 30,000 women trained in about 16 different areas. The ideal in a health post is you know your community so well that you have a registry of all the pregnant women and you have knowledge of when they're likely to deliver, and you're going out and talking to them during their pregnancy. And you have the vaccines in stock, and so after the children are born, you're going to be available. So you have both supply and demand matched up. And then we went to the next level up, the health center, where they have the ability to do a little bit of surgery. They have more drugs, more expertise. Sometimes there'll be a doctor at that level, not always. And the health center manages 5 of these health outposts. It really is a model system.
The health system model, inherited from the time of armed resistance, would be large-scaled after the overthrow of the Derg, with a rapid expansion of primary health care across Ethiopia. The health system in Tigray would show a rapid improvement from just 4 hospitals in 1991 under the Derg regime to 716 health posts, 212 health centers, and 41 hospitals in 2018. The number of health workers would also show a rapid increase from just over 17,000 to 140,000 medical workers in 2018. A health system built over 40 years of concentrated effort and investment was the target of deliberate and systematic destruction by allied Ethiopian and Eritrean forces over the past year. If health facilities were not the target of deliberate physical destruction, the almost 8 months long siege on the region that has blocked off all medical supplies has meant that patients have no access to medication or vaccination. But Dr. Gabriel Barnabas, former head of Tigray's Bureau of Health, says not all is lost, and years of dedicated investment promises a quick and effective recovery for Tigray's health system.
They might have looted our infrastructure, the equipment, and the buildings, but they cannot break our will. Our will remains, and in fact, we are iron-willed people. The people of Tigray are iron-willed, and when peace resumes in a very short period of time, not to my estimate, not more than 5, we will go back to the pre-war, pre-invasion status. We also reckon or expect our former partners to help out financially, technically, if they can, but we will do it on our own if they don't.
Tigrayans from across the globe marched in Brussels on Friday to call attention to the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray and the deliberate obstruction of humanitarian assistance by the Ethiopian government. The march was held during the EU-African summit in Brussels and asked the leaders to halt their supports for Ethiopian leaders and its allies in Eritrea. Haile Gebru has more on that.
Stop talking about people! Stop! Stop! Stop!
For the past 8 months, Tigray has been cut off from all basic services of electricity, health, banking, clean water supply, fuel and transportation. The all-encompassing blockade imposed on Tigray has reached a limit the lives of everyone living in the region. Following this incident, people with Tigray origin from all over the world met in Brussels to march and protest for justice and to stop the genocide in Tigray. They have requested to address the dire crisis of the people of Tigray are faced with the leaders who gathered for the 6th European Union African Union Summit in Brussels, Belgium. The demonstrators called on the European Union and the African Union leaders to stop the support being given to the Abiy Ahmed's government and also to put pressure in order to lift the decision imposed on Tigray, which has put the lives of millions at the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Moreover, they have also requested for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Tigray's territories.
We are gathered here to amplify the voice of the people of Tigray to the international community. Crimes of war and humanitarian crisis are still being committed by the Ethiopian government and its allies, day in, day out. Thus, we are protesting and calling on the EU and AU leaders to stop the genocide in Tigray as soon as possible.
The atrocities are being committed on. The Oromo people are also suffering from the daily massacres carried out by the Abiy Ahmed's government and its allies with the help of combat drones. I am from the Netherlands, and I have joined this epic protest condemning Abiy Ahmed's government and its evil deeds.
Jan Nissen, a professor of geography at Ghent University in Belgium, he is known to have documented the atrocities committed in different parts of Tigray, has also been part of the protest and addressed the issue at the summit in Brussels on Thursday, February 17, 2022.
Good afternoon, my name is Jan. I'm professor in Ghent University in Belgium, and I have been carrying out research in Tigray since almost 30 years now. That means since 1994. We have been going to Tigray for building up Tigray after the civil war. We did every effort to work in order to... Where is my basket? We did everything in order to work, in order to help the farmers in Tigray to fill the basket with food. When I came there the first time in Tigray, people were eating 2 times a day because it was still very poor. Gradually, Tigray was climbing out of misery at least. The country is still poor, but the country was improving and people were eating 3 times a day. And we saw everything improving. I have been working very much for natural restoration, environmental restoration, and also there the people in Tigray did a lot of improvements. And then that war came, and all of a sudden our friends couldn't telephone us anymore. And then after some time we managed to get some contacts and people talking to their friends and the message came out, and we hear very bad stories about massacres. We hear stories about girls and women being raped. The father of one of my best friends, he was an old man. He was not killed, but the soldiers came to his came to his house and they kicked him. And it is ongoing and ongoing. My last telephone call to Mekele was on 27th of June, and people were so happy. Things were going to improve. That was the general feeling. But then now we see that people are starving. Tigray is cut off from the world. We cannot help the people in Tigray. And of course, when I speak to you like this is also how I speak to the international media. We are having millions and millions of suffering. The world is letting Tigray down. We almost see nothing in the media about Tigray anymore. And what we see is that still Tigray continues to be regreening.
And that's it for today's news, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Sablor Lemma with you today. Take care.